evening, everybody. Welcome. We're going to start on time because we have a webinar going on at the same time through Zoom, and I want to be respectful of everybody's schedule. It's great to see everybody. We had the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder's second annual research symposium today, had colleagues from Copenhagen and London, England, and the United States, and so it really energized us talking about some of the themes you'll hear about this evening as it relates to treatment. My name is Dr. Ben Goldstein. I'm the director of the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. I'd like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. KMH is situated on lands that have been occupied by First Nations for millennia, lands rich in civilizations, with extensive trade routes throughout the Americas. In 1860, the site of KMH appeared in the Colonial Records Office of the British Crown as the council grounds of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, as they were known at the time. Today, Toronto is covered by the Toronto Purchase, Treaty Number 13 of 1805 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is now home to a vast diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis who enrich this city. KMH is committed to reconciliation. We will honor the land through programs and places that reflect and respect its heritage. We will embrace the healing traditions of the ancestors and weave them into our caring practices. We will create new relationships and partnerships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and share the land and protect it for future generations. So I'd like to now welcome Dr. Sanjeev Sokalingam. Dr. Sokalingam is Vice President Education, Interim Physician-in-Chief and Clinician Scientist at KMH. He's Professor and Vice Chair Education in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Dr. Sokalingam is also co-chair of the Extension for Community Healthcare Outcomes, ECHO, Ontario Mental Health at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health and the University of Toronto. This is a Ministry Health funded hub and spoke virtual knowledge sharing network, building mental health and addiction capacity in Ontario. Welcome, Dr. Sokalingam.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome all of you to this event and online as well. As Dr. Goldstein said, I'm Dr. Sanjeev Sokalingam, VP Education and Interim Physician-in-Chief at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. It's my pleasure to open up this evening event for the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, or CYBD, the 9th public education event on World Bipolar Day. For those of you who are joining for the first time and maybe online at this event, the CYBD is home to Canada's leading clinical research team focused on youth bipolar disorder and is one of the top centers exploring research and innovation in this area. And why is this center needed, and why are we all here today to learn more about some of the innovation and work? Although bipolar disorder is the 4th leading cause of disability of youth worldwide, bipolar disorder in youth remains relatively under-researched. And the disability and profound impact of bipolar disorder on the lives of many youth, later as adults and families, is significant. I think the impact of bipolar disorder in youth really resonates with me. I haven't spoken about it much, but I actually wanted to share a personal story that, in fact, during my own childhood, I grew up with a close family member who developed bipolar disorder as a youth. And unfortunately, he lost his life in his early 20s. And I reflect on that time because I do wonder at that time, although he was in care, whether innovations in research that could have detected risk factors, both physical and mental health risk factors, interventions early on, and access to treatment, especially innovative treatments, could have changed his course and perhaps saved his life. So I know there are many stories like that in the room, and perhaps many of you are here today because of that. But events like today are important because they give us hope and inspire us to think about the future of youth bipolar care. So with that, I do hope that you enjoy this event today, the remarkable innovations, discoveries, the personal stories, the knowledge that you'll be sharing with one another as you talk about advancing knowledge, optimizing treatment and care for youth with bipolar disorder. And what's unique about the CYBD is this integration of mind, brain, and heart. A focus on heart bipolar connection really offers patients and families a hope for the future, what causes bipolar disorder, how it can be better understood, novel treatment options, and how we can reduce stigma. I know earlier today you had your research symposium, which brought together Canadian and international researchers, trainees, clinicians, and mental health providers to take part in presentations and discussions on current research in bipolar disorder, and really with this emphasis on youth bipolar disorder and heart bipolar link. And again, tonight's event is a reflection of CYBD's mission and dedication to sharing knowledge and research about youth bipolar disorder in order to demystify, increase awareness of the condition, and to inspire hope for a better future. So I'm looking forward to hearing, and I do apologize, I do have to step out because I have a youth at home right now that I may need to attend to, but I look forward to hearing and viewing perhaps the recording afterwards of this inspiring event, as I truly believe it'll be informative, interesting, and inspiring to all of us. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sanjeev, and for sharing that personal anecdote that was moving. So this is my favorite part of the event, which is I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker in a moment. The Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, since our inception in 2009, initially at Sunnybrook, we moved to CAMH in September of 2020. And from very early on, we've really been driven to have a collaboration with our patients and families towards the goal of partnering for a future that's going to be better for youth that are affected by bipolar disorder. So this evening, we had the research day today, that's new, that's just the second year, but this evening has been ongoing now for 9 years, and that's including interruptions of the pandemic. And the purpose was to demystify not just bipolar disorder, but research about bipolar disorder, and to challenge ourselves to convey the meaning that this can have, the relevance that it has for people that are living in the current moment with bipolar disorder, or who have a family member with bipolar disorder. To that end, we've always involved a patient or parent, primarily patients who come and speak about their own lived experience. You heard that this is my favorite part of the night, and you may wonder, why don't we save this for the end of the night? And the reason for that is that I think that hearing from someone with lived experience provides us with the grounding we need to understand exactly why it is that we're here and why we're doing what we're doing. And I think it really kind of solidifies us in coming together on the time that we're spending together this evening. So with that said, it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce to you Sunny, who is an extremely courageous young individual who's been working with us at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder for the past year. And I'm very much looking forward to her comments. Come on up, Sunny.
Hello, bonjour, and henceforth. My name is Sunny Jameson. I am a 16-year-old person from Timmins, Ontario. So just to give an idea, Timmins is over 700 kilometers northwest from here. So here are a few things about who I am and what I enjoy before we get into the reason why I'm here speaking today. First off, I am an avid reader. Romance books are my favorite, and I like to write little short stories in my free time. I have a passion and fascination with neurology and psychology, and I hope to go into psychiatry in the future. I am an air cadet at my local squadron, and I am part of the marching band. This ties along with it. I have been playing the French horn and mellophone for 4 years, and I played the piano for 8 years, starting when I was 5 to around 12 years old. And I am a grade 11 student at my local Catholic high school. So now let's get into why I'm here. I'm here to tell you about my experience with bipolar disorder. So let's start with the past. When I was freshly 10 years old, I had my first manic episode. And honestly, I can't recall about a month of my life because of that. It is truly terrifying having to be told all the terrible things you said and did while manic. So before this episode began, I was put on Prozac and Concerta for generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD. So this is what led to the episode. Personally, I think it was going to happen regardless. This was just the catalyst. And during this episode, I did not sleep for 5 days straight. And I was in imminent danger to myself and others. So because of that, I was hospitalized and put on the Form 1 in early October 2016 for 2 days. So I don't know the protocol at any other psychiatric facility, but at my local hospital in the mental health unit, you see a psychiatrist in the first 24 to 48 hours of being admitted. And for pediatrics, it is only virtual because the nearest child psychiatrist is here in Toronto. And it was a truly terrifying experience, but the part that scares me the most is that I only found out my hospitalization was 2 days fairly recently because I did not remember the first day. So after I was discharged, I was put on quetiapine, and I swear it works magic. And I was feeling more stable for a while, or as stable as you can get with bipolar disorder. So from, I'd say 2017 until early to mid 2019, I didn't have a lot of extreme mood fluctuations. I still had mood fluctuations, but they weren't as severe and they weren't life-threatening. And during this time period, my anxiety was prevalent. And I can tell you, anxiety and bipolar do not mix at all. And my dosage of quetiapine was increased. It wasn't until June 2019 where I started to have low moods. I was in Trenton actually at this time when everything went downhill. And after I got back, my mental health took a swan dive. I was having major suicidal thoughts and ideations, which started in August. And it got so bad in September that I was one movement away from taking my own life. And because of that, I was put on a Form 1 again, September 12th, and I was discharged late into the night of September 13th. And I actually remember this day very clearly because I spent my 13th birthday in the mental health unit. Not a good start to being a teenager, huh? And like I mentioned before, while in hospital, you meet a psychiatrist virtually. This psychiatrist, he started me on Zoloft for depression. And honestly, I thought after my first hospitalization, how I reacted with an SSRI, I wouldn't be put on another one, but I thought wrong. I started to have hypomanic symptoms a couple of days after starting it, and I had to stop this medication abruptly because of that. But it wouldn't have ended up very well. It's hard for me to recall the rest of the year. I was still struggling with low moods, but I can tell you one thing, 2020 was a bust too, for obvious reasons. I started to have hypomanic symptoms at the beginning of February, and those actually lasted quite a while. But luckily, I ended up having a telepsych in May, and I was put on lithium, and those manic symptoms I mentioned before dissipated. And this was actually the first time anyone explored the idea of me having bipolar disorder. After God knows how many telepsychs and back and forth to doctors, it was always, I was too young to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They didn't want to stick that label on me because it lasts forever. I'm a teenager, I'm hormonal. It's just my hormones. And I'm a teenage girl, it's just my period causing me to be like this. So the rest of the year was a blur because for me, lithium side effects are no joke. Like I mentioned before, I don't really remember the rest of 2020, but not much happened after. But in 2021, I started seeing Dr. Goldstein. And honestly, it was the first time a psychiatrist listened to me. And then I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. And during this period, I did sign up for DBT with Jessica. But unfortunately, my mood took another swan dive in September. I was having major suicidal thoughts and ideations, which started in November, and it all peaked in January 2022, where I ended up almost taking my own life again. And I was hospitalized for the last week of January. Great way to start the year. So after I was discharged, I started going 100% to DBT. It was really hard too because of the major depressive episode and the hospitalization. It was a hard battle, and I won. Woohoo! So around March, I was having extreme anxiety, which manifested into tics. And because of this, I did online school for a month. And the isolation from doing online school really did not help with the depression. It sucked, and I handled it. So after this period, Dr. Goldstein started me on lamotrigine in, I'd say around June. And it was really helping, and it helped me to use my DBT skills more often and more effectively. But all good things must come to an end, and I had to go off it due to a rush. But at least my abilities to cope with everything with DBT started to take effect. And in August, I started back on lamotrigine. My mood improved a lot due to the combination of medications and therapy. I was still having low moods, but they weren't as prevalent and they didn't last as long. So enough about the past. Here's the present. So now my mood is starting to increase and I haven't had any manic symptoms for a very long time. I'm continuing DBT because it has helped me so much. My meds are stable and I feel good for the first time in my life. And the truly hilarious thing is that without COVID and everything going virtual, I wouldn't have been able to access DBT or other services the Center of Youth Bipolar Disorder offers. Being from Timmins, it's really hard to get good mental health care, any at all. So I have actually seen upwards of 10 different psychiatrists in the last 6 years. Only 2 of them I have seen more than once, Dr. Goldstein and the psychiatrist in the mental health unit. And I can tell you as a patient, it's really frustrating having to tell these traumatic events over and over and over again. And it's really hard to build a patient and provider relationship. So before being referred to the Center of Youth Bipolar Disorder, nobody listened to me when I said something was really wrong and I might be bipolar. Seeing Dr. Goldstein doing DBT with Jess made me feel like I was being heard. For the first time in my life, a professional listened to me. You know, to Dr. Goldstein and Jessica and the rest of the team at the Center of Youth Bipolar Disorder, thank you so much for helping me and listening to cope with my bipolar disorder. The treatment I have received helped me to achieve things I never thought I could because of bipolar. Bipolar has robbed me of my life up until now, and I am just being able to live how I want to. And as a teenager, few examples of opportunities and things I've achieved I never thought I could because I have bipolar disorder. Number 1, I was recently promoted to Warrant Officer 2nd class of my squadron. That is the 2nd highest rank in Air Cadets. I am now the most senior bandsman, and I have won numerous cadet awards. For example, I've been awarded the Wilford C. Butler Bursary Award. I am the youngest cadet ever to receive this award. And I have been awarded the Royal Canadian Legion Medal of Excellence. That is a medal it's a federal award that only one cadet in the country is awarded every single year. I went from only going to school once a week, best case scenario, to going at least 3 times a week. I am now handing in my assignments. I am having fun at school and doing extracurriculars. And I've been awarded most industrious student 2 years in a row, grade 9 and grade 10. And honestly, without the help I have received, I wouldn't be here alive today. And another opportunity I never thought I could ever do because of bipolar disorder is speaking here in front of you today. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope in the future I can work alongside you as a mental health professional to make sure nobody has to go through what I did. And I hope that if anyone like me is seeing this, that they know they're not alone, that there is always someone who will listen. Thank you. Merci and miigwech.
Wow, Sunny, what is there to say after some comments like that? I think some folks on the team got to see you practice. I did not. So this was really an honor to hear you speak. And thank you so much for your courage on behalf of all the people that are going to be in similar situations and that will need to hear about your experiences, about the tough times and what you've come through. Fantastic. And thank you so much. We hope for the same things for you as well, that you have all those dreams come true and that you inspire other people in the ways that you hope to. And your mom is looking just a smidge proud right now. So no pressure on our next speaker, Andrew Comte. Now, the good thing is we know Andrew has thick skin. He's been working with us for a decade. And Andrew works at Hope and Me, or the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. And this has been a partnership, but this event has been a partnership between the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, Hope and Me, Mood Disorders Association, and patients and families. And so he completes the triangle. He is the Knowledge Translation and Research Manager at Hope and Me. As a longstanding partner with CYBD and CREST BD, which is an international organization focused on knowledge translation in youth bipolar and bipolar in general. He represents the community to optimize the health and quality of life of people living with bipolar disorder. He is also the co-chair of the CanBind Community Advisory Committee and member of the Ontario Brain Institute's Knowledge Translation, Outreach, and Communications team. His interests include patient advocacy, team building, diversity enhancement, and collaboration. And he's an all-around great guy and a great photographer. Andrew, come on up.
Hi, everyone. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you, Sunny, for that was such an incredibly powerful story. Very much appreciate you sharing your journey. So I also want to thank Ben and the entire team for inviting me to speak to you today. So as he had mentioned, I work at Hope and Me, the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. And we've been around for probably over almost going on 37 years now. So we focus a lot on peer support, and we've been around. We definitely provide lots of supports for. We definitely provide lots of supports for adults, youth, family members, and also with caregivers as well. We offer lots of evidence-based services. And we want to make sure that they're designed so that they can support the recovery of individuals and lessen that dependence on acute care. And I thought it was a really good time after, being here for, working with our friends at CYBD for over 10 years. It's a good time to sort of reflect on the hopefulness of the future, especially for all of the great young folks that we have here today, and providing them with sort of hopeful messages about what their next steps and what their journeys are going to be. And I think it's really important that we collaborate with people, working with different organizations, definitely getting the voice of people with lived experience and using that sort of peer support model. Because I think it's there's so much kind of stigma around mental health in general, and particularly with bipolar disorder. And it's kind of really important to open up those discussions and talk about these things in a hopeful sort of way. So I'm just going to give you a really kind of quick overview of some of the programs that we offer. And definitely this will help to increase awareness and outreach so that people can get the help and support that they definitely deserve. So as you can kind of see on the slides, I'm just going to provide you with a short overview of some of our very youth-focused programs, because I think it's really important to work with youth because they have so much to offer. I remember the first time one of our youth volunteers talked to me about TikTok, and I'm going, what's TikTok all about? But then I started trying to use that, and I realized that I was kind of scrolling through that for about an hour. So I think it's kind of really important to hear that youth voice, and especially around mental health and folks living with bipolar disorder. So for today's quick presentation, I'm going to talk about some of our very youth-focused recovery programs. And as you can see on the slides, one of them is a new website that we created called Changing Minds with Youth. We also offer a number of different support groups. One is called Stop, Drop, and Talk. And then we also developed a new series of short kind of little videos called Boost Your Mood. And also we created a series of podcasts called What's on Your Mind. And we offer lots of different youth support groups as well. We've also partnered with a number of different clinical organizations as well, and we definitely use that peer support model and provide different resources for a number of different clinical settings and hospitals as well. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Changing Minds with Youth website. So basically, the Changing Minds youth website, it's kind of really important because it was actually designed by and built for youth. And the important 3 points for this website, it's an opportunity for them to kind of connect and share and support one another. And they're able to provide and access tools and resources and also learn from one another, because using that kind of peer support model is kind of really important. So, you know, sometimes if you're talking to your family doctor, your clinician, it's kind of a one-way street. So using that peer support model is you can kind of share your own personal experiences, but also kind of learn from one another as well. So on this website, you'll find information on a wide range of mental health topics, different tools to manage mental health challenges. You're able to access different resources, including both in-person and virtual peer support groups as well. And also we created an online forum so you can engage and connect with other youth. And basically the aim of this new website is to sort of empower youth and provide them with the support so they can manage their different mental health challenges. And the one really important thing is to know that you're not alone in your journey. So next up, I'm just going to talk a little bit about another support group that we offer called Stop, Drop, and Talk. So again, this was another support group that was designed by young folks. So this is a drop-in kind of peer support that we offer online for youth and young adults 14 to 29 who are affected by mood disorders and related kind of challenges. And the facilitators are actually youth folks as well. So the basic aim of these support groups are to sort of empower and provide youth with the supports so they can help manage their mental health, and they can talk about some of their challenges and know that they're not alone in their particular journey. We also want to make sure that this is a very kind of safe and inclusive space. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new Booster Mood webinar kind of series. And I know they're going to show this online, but I'll just give a quick overview before they provide this online. But we developed a series of very kind of short webinar kind of series. They're about 2 minutes long. So oftentimes a lot of, even myself, are always kind of on our phones, and many kind of struggle to find useful evidence-based information. So it was kind of really important for us to provide kind of evidence-based information for youth living with bipolar. And these series of 2-minute videos can help young folks kind of learn and focus on doing different kind of goals in terms of what's kind of important in their own personal recovery. And the Boost Your Mood website series provides direct information about wellness, focusing on wellness strategies, mental health, and things around mindfulness as well. So other topics include focusing on resilience, which is really crucial, empathy, stigma, stress, anxiety, and oftentimes these have been created on a monthly basis. So keep a lookout on any of these if you're actually interested in them. So next, I think our friends are going to share the video.
At Open we emphasize lived experience as a powerful pathway to hope, healing, and recovery. We offer peer support training and a variety of free programs to support clients living with and affected by depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorders. We provide the following programs: drop-in peer support, which is a supportive network of others with shared experience offering peer support counseling. We offer peer support training, which is evidence-based training for youth, adults, families, and workplaces that includes a toolbox of practical skills in a community of practice model. We offer recovery programs, which are psychoeducational and recovery groups providing clients with peer support, education, and coping skills. Furthermore, we provide family and youth clinical support, which are clinical support services for family members challenged with complex mental health and addiction issues. We provide early intervention for mood disorders and psychosis, counseling for families of young people who are living with a mood disorder and or psychosis, but who do not yet have a diagnosis. And finally, we provide collaborative care partnership with Sunnybrook, which is counseling for families of young people who are living with a mood disorder and or psychosis, but who do not yet have a diagnosis. At Hope in Me, we live by our mantra, talk to someone who has been there. Peer support aims to humanize the recovery process through the involvement of people with lived experience. Peer support works by offering individual support, encouragement, and hope that recovery is indeed possible. Peer support means not only being listened to, but being understood.
Thanks so much for listening to that 2-minute video. There's going to be a number of different ones that are coming out every month. And as I mentioned before, they're going to be focusing on different topics. But what's kind of really important is that our youth facilitators are going to be creating all these great workshop series. So next up, I also wanted to mention that we have also created series of podcasts that's called What's on Your Mind. So they basically focus on youth mental health from their lived experience. So some of the topics that they've created is giving a student's point of view, learnings from the pandemic, and learnings also from the post-pandemic as well. So this podcast series is available on multiple platforms. It's offered on Spotify, Apple Music, and a whole bunch of other different podcast platforms if you're ever interested. And I also want to mention that our motto is we have a very small amount of staff, but we have tons of amazing volunteers. And basically every staff member, board member, volunteer has have actual lived experience or been a caregiver of someone living with different types of mood disorders. So one of our mottos is talk to someone who's been there. So it was kind of really important for us to have these youth support groups. We also have these youth and young adults groups that are run kind of virtually. So we can actually, we're a provincial organization. So we're using more of a hybrid model. We offer some in-person groups, but also online so that we can reach a lot of the smaller communities as well. And they can talk about their different mental health challenges and look for supports in sort of a two-way street. You can talk about what's kind of going on, but also kind of share your own personal experiences from a recovery standpoint. And these are definitely very empathetic peers. So I'm getting towards the end, but I thought I'd just quickly share a couple of our many kind of free programs. We've been around for over 37 years now. But if you're kind of isolated and alone, we have what's called a warm line. So if you're kind of struggling, you want to kind of chat with someone, we have lots of great staff and volunteers. And you can find out, you can talk to them about what's kind of going on. And if you're interested, you can learn more about our different recovery programs. As I'd mentioned, we also offer virtual peer support groups. Sometimes people may not be comfortable talking in a group setting for the first time. So it's kind of really important that we actually offer one-on-one peer support as well. And we also have registered therapists as well. So we offer free 8 weeks of counseling. And we also offer a number of recovery-focused webinars. So on my last slide, I just want to say a huge thank you to Ben and the entire CYBD team. It's been a true pleasure working with all of you for all of these years. I'm like truly grateful for all of the supports that you guys have provided to us all these years. And I just want to say a sincere thank you and heart bipolar disorder.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thank you right back to you. It's been really enjoyable I think for those who may have attended in past years, they would have known that the way we came together was we had some concern that people were worried about research, that it was something that would compromise people's privacy, or that it was something that wasn't in the service of people's lived experience. And so Andrew and Anne-Marie, with whom he works, did a survey actually of Hope and Me, and the answer from their constituents was resoundingly that, yes, we want our privacy addressed. However, we also see hope in research. And so that was like the beginning of this. And I hope, Andrew, that over the next 10 years, we'll have much more to report and more successes mutually. So thank you for being here. So a couple of comments I just wanted to make. First of all, just to say thank you to the CYBD team, and to, in particular, Danielle Curcio. I don't know where she is right now. She's in the back corner. Oh, there she is. I don't know. There's a blinding light at the very back. You won't see her, but Danielle, well into her pregnancy, has spearheaded this entire event and organized our crew, who worked so well together and made this seamless. As you may imagine, it takes a lot to bring something like this together in an organized way. And so thank you, Danielle. So now to the next part of our evening is we're going to have one of the core mandates of the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder is to make sure that there are more people studying and treating youth bipolar disorder in the future than there are now. So there's some people in the audience who I'll call out and embarrass by name later when we get to content that relates directly to them. You know who you are. But there was a small number of people in this field, and in part that's what drew me to it, was like, how can you have this condition so interesting, so important, so relevant, and yet so understudied? And unfortunately, there hasn't been the growth in the intellectual capital in terms of the number of people who are doing this. And so we really need to make sure that we're a training platform for people to come and study and learn about youth bipolar disorder, and then launch and put a times 10 beside whatever our efforts are. So that's the preamble for the three people you're going to hear about shortly, who are all early career individuals. What I'll say, we will take a Q&A. What we ask is there will be people that are walking up and down the aisles that will have cue cards and pass them down to you with golf pencils. If you have questions, please write them down and then pass them to the end of the aisle, and we'll kind of go through them and ask questions to our panel at the end of this evening. The last thing I wanted to mention before introducing our next speaker is the context of seriousness. And I think, Sunny, that you did a great job of speaking in a super responsible way about some realities about bipolar disorder that are daunting, that are intimidating, that make us afraid. But there's something that we can't pretend don't exist. Because if we pretend they don't exist, we won't mount the efforts needed to make sure that they're better down the road. And so that's some context for some of the things you're going to hear about tonight, which is that this is a complicated illness that has some negative aspects to it. Otherwise, you can't have it both ways. It can't be one of the most complicated medical conditions and be easy peasy, right? But I want to preface these presentations by saying that I think that this is part of a journey towards a future that is better, and it will involve seeing some information and hearing some material that may be upsetting, and I think that's a normal human reaction. So with that said, I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Aaron Silverman. Aaron completed his residency training, a general residency training at the University of Toronto Department of Psychiatry, then did his subspecialty child psychiatry training at the University of Ottawa. He, to the best of my knowledge, was not heavily involved in research, but he joined us part-time, working a couple of days a week with us. And I see the seed of research interest starting to grow in him. And so I want to water that seed and encourage it and bring him over to this, clinician scientist role. So Aaron, we look forward to hearing your comments about the symptoms of depression among youth with bipolar disorder versus unipolar depression. Come on up.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, my name is Aaron. I'm a psychiatrist, and I just joined the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder just over a year ago. And it's been my privilege to work with such a great team. So tonight I'm going to be talking about research looking at the characteristics of depression in youth that have bipolar disorder, and also comparing that with the characteristics of depression when youth have unipolar depression, also known as major depressive disorder. So just to start out, going to talk about bipolar spectrum disorders and how they're defined by manic spectrum symptoms. So mania is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, along with increased energy and goal-directed activity. And it goes along with 3 or 4 other symptoms. And different bipolar spectrum disorders differ in terms of how long these episodes last for, but also in terms of how severely the episodes impact people. And so even though mania is really the defining feature of bipolar disorder, depression is more common and can be more impairing across the lifespan for people of all ages. And in youth, from findings from different studies, so US COPE study is a landmark study in youth bipolar disorder, as well as with some of the findings in Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. It looks like youths with bipolar disorder have spent around 40% or more of the time with impairing depressive symptoms. So this really highlights, how important of an area it is to understand and develop better treatments for. So in terms of what we understand about the features of depression in bipolar disorder and how they're distinguished from unipolar depression, from adult findings, we know that there's a few differences in terms of what the symptoms are more likely to be. So some of the symptoms are opposite, and so physical symptoms, for example, like increased sleep and fatigue is more likely in bipolar disorder versus difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep in unipolar. People with bipolar depression are more likely to have a reactive mood. So in other words, mood improves in response to external events. And it also, they're more likely to have certain symptoms that might put them at higher risk, or might be more impairing, like psychotic symptoms or suicidal thoughts. Looking at what we know about bipolar depression in youth and how that differs from unipolar depression, some of the findings have some similarities, such as mood reactivity and the likelihood of non-suicidal self-injury. But these findings are really only based on one study, and there's a need for more research in this area to better understand bipolar depression in youth. And that's what we sought out to do in this study. So we looked at 373 youth that had been referred for assessment of bipolar disorder, and 208 of those youth met the criteria and received a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and 165 didn't meet the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but had a major depressive episode, and so were given the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. And these are the findings. So on the bottom are different symptoms of depression, and the height is the severity of those symptoms for the different groups. So what you can see is that for all of the depressive symptoms, they're more severe for youth with bipolar disorder than for unipolar depression. And that seems to be true across different areas of depression, so including mood, some of the depressive thought patterns, the physical symptoms, and also suicidal ideation. And it seems like some of the bigger differences are in terms of mood, fatigue and oversleeping, as well as suicidal ideation. So to summarize some of the findings, so multiple depressive symptoms across different domains are more severe in bipolar depression, and in particular, highlighting that this includes symptoms with risk like suicidal thoughts, and really highlights the need for really focusing on bipolar depression. One thing to note is that in this study, the comparison group was also referred for assessment of bipolar disorder, even though they didn't meet the criteria. And so in a lot of ways, there were a lot of similarities between the two groups, apart from having the diagnosis of bipolar disorder or not, like in terms of other mental health conditions, such as anxiety. And so I think that the differences that we see are more likely to reflect true differences between bipolar and unipolar depression. And so I think this really highlights how we need more progress regarding novel treatment approaches, and to really understand what are some of the reasons that, or the factors that contribute to bipolar depression having more severe symptoms. There are a number of effective treatments that we do have for bipolar depression in youth, and there are pharmacological treatments. So some in the class of second generation antipsychotic medications, for example, lorazepam being one of the ones with the most robust evidence. Then there's some mood stabilizing medications. And sometimes we can consider traditional antidepressants in some situations. And there are a number of psychological interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and family-focused therapy, which is more available in research-based settings right now, but can also have a lot of evidence for effectiveness, and focuses on psychoeducation, improving family communication, and building other skills, as well as interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, which also is more available in research settings currently, but focuses on the relationship between mood and social relationships, as well as daily routines and habits. And so we do have a number of treatments that can be effective, but there's a need for more research and development of new treatments, because depression can still take a long time to improve, and we don't always know which treatments are going to be effective for which individuals. And we also need more research on not treatments just that help to improve depression, but what helps to stay well. Some of the thoughts about ways that we can improve outcomes, recognizing the signs and symptoms of depression early and intervening as early as possible with approaches that are supported by evidence, combining medications with therapy. The medications can help to alleviate the symptoms and improve functioning, but the therapy can help to build skills that we can carry with us through life. I think it's also important to persist in the goal of recovery. It can take time, and the first interventions aren't always going to be the ones that are effective, and it does require patience and persistence. I think thinking also about the things that we can do just on a day-to-day basis outside of formal treatments, just building habits of around sleep, thinking about nutrition and exercise, minimizing substance use, and we need continued research to identify novel approaches. So I want to thank all the research participants, their families, and the research collaborators, the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder team, and Ben for his mentorship, and Michaela Dimmick and Jess Barton for their contribution to the research as well.
Thanks, Aaron. That was great. As I mentioned, we're going to do all the Q&A at the end. So hold your thoughts. If you have them, write them down, send them to the end of the aisle, and we will address them. So our next presenter is Joyce Jang, and Joyce is an extraordinarily talented PhD student who's midway through her second year. I enjoyed a special moment yesterday introducing Joyce to Sunny, and because Sunny had come in yesterday, as you heard, she comes from a long distance away, and Joyce asked Sunny, she goes, "Are you nervous?" And Sunny said, "I am super nervous." And then Sunny said to Joyce, "Are you nervous?" And she said, "I'm super nervous." So we saw how the first nervous went, and I'm very confident how the second nervous is going to go. Joyce, come on up and tell us about the genetics of bipolar disorder.
Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. I am nervous. All right. So hello, guys. My name is Joyce, and I'm currently in my second year of PhD at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder at CAMH. For today, I'd like to talk about my PhD thesis, which mainly focuses on the genetics of youth bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is a highly heritable psychiatric disease, even when compared to most other psychiatric diseases. So let's take a look at this graph on the left. Each color bar in this graph indicates a common psychiatric disease, and taller bar indicates higher heritability. As you can see, bipolar disorder, as shown in red, is really the most heritable, with a heritability up to 85%. This is almost double the heritability of major depressive disorder, as shown in blue. In addition, studies have shown that early onset bipolar disorder is especially heritable when compared to adult onset bipolar disorder. So altogether, this highlights the importance of genetic factors in youth bipolar disorder. And in recent years, it has become clear that, like many other complex medical conditions, such as diabetes or cardiovascular disease, bipolar disorder is polygenic. This means that a lot of genes are involved in bipolar disorder, but each of them only makes a very small contribution to the overall risk. And it is, in fact, the combined effect of all of these genes that together increase an individual's genetic risk for bipolar disorder. Therefore, polygenic risk score has been developed to compile the effect of many genes into a single score, and it quantifies an individual's genetic risk for a given condition. And the more genetic markers that individuals carry, the higher score they will get, which means higher genetic risk for that condition. Recently, a group of researchers from the University of Pittsburgh examined polygenic risk scores for bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, and ADHD based on prior studies in adults. They compared these scores between the offspring of parents with bipolar disorder, as shown in orange, and offspring of parents without bipolar disorder, as shown in blue. As you can see from this graph, the offspring of parents with bipolar disorder tend to have higher scores for all of these psychiatric diseases. But the largest difference, and the only one that was statistically significant, was for bipolar disorder. And this supports the specificity of polygenic risk score for bipolar disorder among individuals with bipolar disorder. So this is a very important finding for the field. However, only a small number of offspring in the study actually developed bipolar disorder. So whether polygenic risk scores are elevated in youth with bipolar disorder remains as an important question. So we conducted another study at CYBD to examine polygenic risk scores specifically in youth bipolar disorder. We included 3 groups of youth in this study, including youth with bipolar disorder, as shown in orange, and psychiatrically healthy youth, as shown in green, and a high risk group, as shown in blue. These youth were considered high risk for bipolar disorder because they were referred to CYBD to be assessed for bipolar disorder, but they were found to not meet diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder. And the youth in this high-risk group were otherwise very similar to youth with bipolar disorder in terms of the rate of depression, co-occurring psychiatric diagnoses, and family psychiatric history. As you can see, our findings are very similar to the study from the University of Pittsburgh, where the polygenic risk scores were the highest in youth with bipolar disorder, lowest in healthy youth, and intermediate in youth who are at high risk for bipolar disorder. And also similar to the Pittsburgh study, the difference was the largest with polygenic risk score for bipolar disorder, again supporting its specificity. So why does all of that matter? Well, despite with all the research progress over the past 20 years, there is still a lot of ongoing debates and controversies over the validity of youth bipolar disorder. Therefore, demonstrating that youth bipolar disorder is associated with similar genetic risk as adult bipolar disorder is an important advance to reduce misconceptions or stigma over youth bipolar disorder. And these genetic findings add on to the fact that youth bipolar disorder shares a very similar clinical course of illness as adult bipolar disorder. And these findings together validate that this is indeed the same illness that affects adults. In addition to increasing acceptance and reducing stigma towards youth bipolar disorder, polygenic risk scores have the potential to be clinically helpful. A recent study found that adding polygenic risk score for bipolar disorder to traditional clinical measures significantly improved the prediction for new onset bipolar disorder. Therefore, this type of applications of polygenic risk scores could lead to more personalized decisions over monitoring or treatment. And finally, although there's not enough time to go over this in detail today, we also found that polygenic risk score for bipolar disorder is associated with differences in brain structure and function in youth with and without bipolar disorder. And these brain differences may contribute to the mood symptoms that define bipolar disorder. So overall, we hope that bringing together polygenic risk scores, brain imaging, and careful clinical evaluation could enhance our understanding of the causes of bipolar disorder and help guide future prevention and treatment. And with that, I'd like to thank patients, research participants, and their families, as well as our lab members at CYBD. Thank you for listening.
So I predicted right, Joyce. That was fantastic. And thank you for presenting that in a way that's so digestible, so understandable for everybody, and bringing meaning to what's otherwise a scientific finding. Joyce, you rocked it. So our final early career investigator is Michaela Dimmick, Dr. Michaela Dimmick. So Michaela came to us at CYBD, I think it's 8 years ago now, as a research assistant at first, and then entered graduate school in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the University of Toronto. She completed her PhD last August and elected to stay on as a postdoctoral fellow at CYBD. This is relatively atypical. Usually people finish a PhD and then they go somewhere else to learn something different. But Michaela is captivated by the topic of youth bipolar disorder. And so we were, fortunately for me, fortunately for us, the right place for her to stay. She's been an award-winning researcher at a young age. So she won last year the Samuel Gershon Junior Investigator Award from the International Society for Bipolar Disorders. This is a highly prestigious award that is typically won by people that are 8 to 10 years ahead of Michaela in their career. I think it speaks to her talent and her work, but also the subject of her work. Her current postdoctoral fellowship is supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So there's a lot of stamps of approval. And what Michaela is tasked with tonight is talking about the very delicate topic that you heard Sunny address, and that you also heard Dr. Sokolingam address, And so we're looking forward to hearing about the neurobiology underlying suicide risk and what this could potentially do in terms of benefiting future generations. Dr. Dimmock.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you all for being here. So yeah, my name is Michaela and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. And my research focuses on suicidality in youth with bipolar disorder. So today I'm going to share some findings with you from our group and from others. And as Ben mentioned, I just want to preface this talk by saying that this is obviously a very difficult yet very important topic. However, the status quo is really not acceptable. So we need to have a better understanding in order to guide treatment and inform prevention strategies. So tonight I'm going to tell you about some of the tools that we use to learn more about suicide risk. So suicide is the second leading cause of death in youth overall, and it's the leading cause of death among young females. Prior suicide attempts and non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors are leading risk factors. And we know that adolescence is a really important developmental period, and this is usually the same time that these self-harm behaviors begin. So studying this risk in youth is really important to improve the intervention and prevention strategies specifically for this population. Early onset bipolar disorder, or that which begins in adolescence, is characterized by a more severe course of illness. And importantly, these youth are at very high risk for suicide. The rates of self-harm are even higher in youth with bipolar disorder compared to the general population, with almost 1 in 4 youth having an attempt, and as many as 1/2 of youth with bipolar disorder engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. So this figure shows you the rates of suicide attempts, non-suicidal self-injury, and suicidal thoughts in our sample of almost 200 youth with bipolar disorder. So overall, you can see that 3/4 of our sample had at least one of these thoughts and behaviors. So therefore, this is a really important topic that we need to be able to discuss, treat, and study. So I also want to note that although youth with bipolar disorder are at high risk for suicide, the vast majority of individuals with bipolar disorder do not go on to die by suicide, despite having these thoughts and behaviors. So a group of researchers in Pittsburgh followed more than 400 youth with bipolar disorder over the course of 5 years. And they found that in this time, almost 1 in 5 youth had an attempt, and almost 1 in 10 youth had multiple attempts. They then looked at various demographic and clinical risk factors to see which ones were more likely to be associated with youth who went on to make an attempt in that follow-up period. And they found that the strongest predictors were female sex, which is in line with what we know about self-harm in youth, worse depression symptoms, having a 1st or 2nd degree family member with depression, having a substance use disorder, and interestingly, having more treatment. So these studies help us to understand more about the clinical risk factors, specifically among youth with bipolar disorder. So my research uses neuroscience to understand the brain basis of suicide risk. In one study, we used a brain scanner to look at brain circuitry in reward-related brain regions. So these brain regions are responsible for governing activities such as experiencing pleasure and taking risks. We examined 3 groups of youth, those with bipolar disorder with and without a history of self-harm, as well as a group of psychiatrically healthy youth. And although we were expecting to find a progressive increase across the control group, then youth with bipolar disorder and no self-harm, and the group with self-harm being the most different, we actually found a different pattern of results. The group with bipolar disorder and no history of self-harm, shown in that center red bar, were most different, with the self-harm group having the similar brain circuitry to our controls. So we examined the same 3 groups of youth in relation to risk-taking using a gambling task. And youth that bet more points are taking bigger risks. And there's evidence to suggest that this extends to real-life risk-taking. So now looking at the graph on the right, this is showing us the proportion of points that the individuals chose to bet on the gambling task, with more points representing more risky decision-making. So we found a very similar pattern as the brain circuitry findings, where youth without self-harm again shown in the red, differed compared to the other two groups. So we think these findings mean that there's an adaptive effect happening in the group without self-harm. And this could possibly be serving as a protective mechanism against suicide risk. It's possible that these youth have an inherent ability to be cautious, or this is something that they learn through experiences over their lifetime. So these findings are sort of an overview of the work from my PhD. And this shows us that there are, in fact, underlying brain differences associated with self-harm. And I'm planning to use these neuroscience approaches to understand more about how various treatments for suicide reduction work. So one approach to reducing suicide risk is a specific type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. And this was originally developed for adults, specifically females with borderline personality disorder. It involves weekly therapy sessions and focuses on developing behavioral skills, including mindfulness, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and emotion regulation as therapeutic tools. And importantly, we know that this type of therapy reduces self-harm. So that same group of researchers in Pittsburgh decided to modify the original DBT to incorporate both age-appropriate and illness-specific adaptations for youth with bipolar disorder and suicidality. So they decided to include a skills training that's delivered to individual families, a psychoeducation module, including education about DBT and about youth bipolar disorder, skills tailored for bipolar disorder mood states, and a modified treatment schedule to deliver this treatment over the course of 1 year. And they found that DBT does work well to reduce suicidality, improve emotion regulation, and improve depression in youth with bipolar disorder. And we have some studies of DBT here at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, which you'll learn more about from Dr. Goldstein shortly. So how can neuroscience help? We believe that understanding the neurobiological mechanisms can help us find objective measures of suicide risk. And these objective measures can in turn be used as treatment targets and to inform prevention strategies. We also think that neuroscience can help us learn more about how treatments work. Dialectical behavior therapy, like any therapy or medicine, doesn't help with all symptoms in all people. But we think that learning about the brain differences can help us learn more about who may benefit from this therapy the most and when. And lastly, the new knowledge that we've gained through neuroscience research and the continued understanding and increased awareness that there is in fact a brain basis of self-harm hopefully helps reduce the stigma that's faced with youth with bipolar disorder and self-harm. Importantly, I would just like to acknowledge all of our wonderful patients and families for their participation in our research, as well as our funding sources, and to Dr. Goldstein for his mentorship and all my teammates at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. That was great. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that is really looking forward to seeing what you do over the next few years, and hopefully in partnership with others in the room who are focused on DBT. I think it's a great, as to quote our colleague and friend Eric Youngstrom, it's a peanut butter meets chocolate moment where it's better for everybody. So what I'm going to do over as the person that brings these other individuals together, I gave myself more time, so you'll forgive me for that. But part of the reason for that is I'm providing an overview of the overall activities of the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. Each year we have different themes. This theme has been Next Generation. You've seen 3 individuals from the Next Generation. You saw the offspring data. Our invited speakers from this morning were largely focused on parent offspring studies. And so my aspect of the theme of Next Generation is Next Generation treatments. So you heard from everybody that things are headed in the right direction, but they're not there yet. And so the question is, what can we do to make them better yet? We can't just keep giving people the same exact treatments. I think we should, right? Give them the best available treatment, but we can't rest on our laurels, because as you saw, in particular, as it relates to depression, for Aaron's talk, 40% of the time with depression, these types of rates of suicidality, they're just, to quote Michaela, status quo is not acceptable. So this is really what I'm going to focus on. I have no commercial interests. We do have funding from a variety of organizations, which I disclose at the end. They're all non-proprietary. So I don't think Nikki Kozloff is in the room, but she is a staff psychiatrist and clinician scientist at CAMH, and during her residency training, published this study based on the Canadian Community Health Survey. So it's a representative population study, meaning it's not like CYBD where we look at people that have knocked on the door looking for services. This is just scanning the general population and doing a semi-structured interview to determine who has bipolar disorder and then look at their characteristics. You can see in the two columns, the teenagers and then the young adults. And what I highlight in particular is that this is not a hospital-based sample. This is not a hospital, this is not an emergency department sample. This is a sample that you happen to knock on their door representing the general population. And what you see is 41% had an anxiety disorder, 32% a substance use disorder, 55% had suicidality. This is a non-clinical sample. And you would think, wow, hopefully they're in good treatment. But then you look at the number that had received any sort of treatment. And in this study, treatment was defined as any sort of mental health treatment. It wasn't subspecialized bipolar disorder treatment. This was talking to a counselor, talking to your family doctor, seeing a psychologist, anything. And less than 50% had any sort of treatment. And you know, it's stymieing to think about how can it be that someone is so impacted and hasn't had any treatment. But that, you know, I hope times have changed. It's been probably 15 years since that study was conducted, but I can tell you by virtue of the amount of time people have been suffering by the time they come for care, that a lot of people, they wait a long time because of wait lists. This is a reality. And a lot of people have a pre-wait because of the types of things you heard about from Sunny. It's hormones, or it's your parents, or it's whatever the case may be, other than a major medical condition. So this gives us the context of what we're working with. You've heard a lot about the Pittsburgh group. It's not because we're biased by knowing them. It's because that group has really led a lot of the most seminal research in this field in large samples. And so we've learned a lot from them. They also give us a basis of comparison for a lot of our work. So what you see here is the rates of recovery. I think that the graph itself is not important in its detail. It reflects the three different subtypes. You heard from Aaron that there's three different subtypes: bipolar 1 disorder, bipolar 2 disorder, and what would be called bipolar spectrum. I won't belabor those differences. I think Aaron captured them in terms of their severity and persistence. But the point is, if you take all of these youth with bipolar disorder and you follow them over time, eventually the vast majority recover. So symptomatic recovery means 8 straight weeks where there was no functional impairment, no significant suffering from either manic or depressive symptoms. So you'd say 8 weeks is not that much. It's a good predictor of longer recovery. And so it's something that we think of as a good proxy for someone who's likely to spend some time feeling well. So at the 2.5-year follow-up in this course and outcome of bipolar use study, 81% had met symptomatic recovery. This is good news. What happens when you follow those people that have recovered continually over time? And similar to adults with bipolar disorder, this is an episodic recurrent condition. So 2/3 had a recurrence of a syndromal episode, meaning like a full major depression or a full hypomania or manic episode over the subsequent 1.5 years. Again, so echoing things that you've already heard tonight from Joyce, that yes, this has got the same genetics as adult bipolar disorder. It also travels very similarly to adult bipolar disorder, and that's because it is bipolar disorder. There's a couple of small differences. One is that youth with bipolar disorder on average spend more of their time symptomatic. So whereas adults with bipolar disorder on average spend about 60% of their time asymptomatic and 40% symptomatic, youth with bipolar disorder actually spend most of their time with impairing mood symptoms. And you know, if you add up that difference, it's another month of their year in and year out, affected by symptoms. Now, none of us want to have symptoms. Anybody that's had sadness, which is all of us in the room, doesn't feel good. Neither does anxiety. But having it persistently over time through high school, you know, each month makes a big difference. So I think that when we say that youth bipolar on average is more severe than adult bipolar disorder, it's an unapologetic statement. I believe it to be true. One of the advantages we heard about this morning in our scientific sessions about the bipolar study from Pittsburgh and Rhode Island and UCLA is that they have now followed those youth into their early 30s. So they have 20 years of data. They published an 8-year follow-up study, and what we learned from that study was that by the 8-year follow-up point, so these people came in on average at the age of 12, and so by the 8-year follow-up, they are on average early 20s. So at that point, 50% were doing well the majority of the time, like more than 80% of the time. So that's half of the group that is living quite a good life overall from a mood perspective. A quarter were doing well about half the time. Now, I don't think that's very good 50% of the time. It means that they hadn't really changed from the beginning of their illness. And, this is the type of thing that motivates us to add new treatments, right? So how come in all that time they didn't get better? And then there's a quarter that is, most of the time not doing well. And I think all of these groups need treatments, but I think there's some positivity here to say that 50% of people are doing well most of the time. This is a good thing. Another question is, how do we bring along the other 50%, move people up this ladder? That's a Pittsburgh study, and UCLA and Rhode Island. It's the US. There are some differences between the US and Canada, socialized healthcare, a number of other differences, and we may think, well, maybe it's a little bit better north of the border. It's the exact same north of the border, despite the differences in our countries and our healthcare systems. One of the differences between our study that I'm presenting here and the Kobe study is that in the Kobe study, people could come in any mood state. So some came in a decent mood and some people came in acutely ill. In the study that we did, you had to be acutely ill to come in. You had to be in the midst of hypomania or mania or major depression. And I say that to provide the context for the fact that, people spent 51% of the next year and a half with impairing symptoms, and only 19% of the youth, and these were youth that we were treating, like I was treating a lot of these youth to the best of my ability, and 1 in 4 of them are getting better. And these are the youth that are, able to show up for appointments, able to show up for research studies. I don't present the data here, but this is actually a biomarker study. So these were the type of youth whose families were organized and willing enough to have them come in for repeated blood tests. I would say they're probably, part of the better group in terms of capacity to receive treatment and benefit from it. So this is really sobering, right? And then the question is, how can we increase the rate of recovery so that, at the end of a year and a half, we're not at 19%, but maybe 70%. And how can we accelerate the time to recovery? Each month counts. Wanted to provide more context for providing information that would help make sense of why this is so difficult to treat. I've been focusing about mood, and you've heard about mood and suicidality primarily this evening, but mood and suicidality are not the only things that youth with bipolar disorder are struggling with. As you can see here, the main thing on a day-to-day basis that my average patient and the average youth with bipolar disorder around the world, I would say, struggles with is anxiety, persistent, difficult to treat anxiety. And I think that anxiety has some excellent treatments in the absence of the context of bipolar disorder, but in the context of bipolar disorder, and I think Sunny really brought that to life for us, someone prescribed you the right medicines, at the time, but they presented a challenge. Now that we know that, that means that a same individual that has flipped to become to have bipolar disorder, we're now kind of constrained in that option. And so we're kind of handcuffed against one of the bigger challenges. ADHD is common, substance use disorders, eating disorders, somewhat less so. Psychosis, in particular, youth with bipolar 1 disorder, that's most of the youth with psychosis. Those are people that have delusions, who have fixed and false beliefs, or have hallucinations that affect their functioning. About half of our youth with bipolar 1 disorder have that. It's relatively uncommon in the other groups. And then trauma is important as well, with about 1 in 10 having post-traumatic stress disorder. Family members are also having their own challenges. So in addition to having to manage the fact that they have often multiple youth at home, and then you have youth who have an illness. We heard from Dr. Tina Goldstein today, who's in the audience, about the fact that there are, this places a big burden within families, within the healthcare system. And so it adds to that challenge. But the families of these youth are highly affected by psychiatric illnesses. And this is something that we really don't talk about much in the field, is a vision towards how do you have a multi-generational approach to treatment so that you're not treating an individual, but also helping their context. DBT addresses that to some extent, but in contemporary models of psychiatric care, you don't really bring the whole family in, each of them for treatment. And I think it's a mistake, especially in an illness that's so familial as bipolar disorder is. Aaron gave you a summary of antidepressant options. I just wanted to kind of quickly give you a mile-high view of where I think the level of knowledge is. When I say knowledge, I mean not just clinical experience, but research-driven and evidence-based knowledge. We've had a lot of studies about anti-manics. We have multiple options. It's not to say that it's always easy to treat, but there are a lot of effective options. The main gap as it relates to treating mania is that for people that don't respond right away, we don't have a lot of studies about combinations of treatments for acute mania. For depression, you heard there's a number of options, but there's not nearly enough randomized controlled trials. So a lot of what we know is based on open studies. So a person will come into the study and get a medication like lamotrigine or like lithium, which we know about from adults, but they still haven't been compared to placebo. And I think we really have to do that to know which is best and which is best for whom. And as you can see from the plus symbols, the level of evidence is going down as we go down this list. Next along the line is ADHD. So for those roughly 40% of youth who have ADHD as well as bipolar disorder, provided that their mood is stabilized, a couple of studies have shown that it's safe and effective. By safe, I mean there hasn't been a lot of precipitation of manic episodes in those youth. And those youth who have been on ADHD medicines, especially stimulants, have had an improvement in their ADHD. The challenge is when you're looking at a relatively infrequent event like triggering a manic episode, you need much larger studies than what we've had. So I can give patients a rough estimate when I'm getting their informed consent, but I wish I had, people 500 in a trial rather than 50 or 70 or 80. Substance use disorders, there's a lot of good psychosocial treatments for substance use disorders, but there's not a lot of good pharmacological treatments other than, primarily for opiates and for alcohol, but for something like cannabis, less frequently in the population that we see, cocaine, things like that, there's really not a lot of good pharmacological evidence. But the evidence about the treatment of addictions in the context of youth bipolar disorder is quite slim. And then finally, you heard the highest comorbidity or co-occurring illness was anxiety, 81%. This is what we see day in and day out. And there's really very, very little known. And what's known is incidental. It was like a secondary measure in a study that didn't explicitly set out to treat anxiety. So you can see here that there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think I missed one, which was episode prevention. We have lots of good data from adults about what do you do once someone's better, which medicines are good for continuing, how long do you continue? And we have much more evidence than we had 10 years ago, but we're way, way behind adults. And I think we can't fully borrow just from the adults. So with that background, I wanted to talk to you about a few areas that the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder is looking at when it comes to novel treatments. I don't present these as the best ever treatments or the only treatments. They're the ones that we've chosen. And I hope that the rationale for our choices is clear to you at the end of this evening. And those choices are dialectical behavior therapy, aerobic exercise interventions, and nitrous oxide, probably the bigger of the three surprises, I might estimate, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So dialectical behavior therapy, this is an intervention that I think is effective in part because it addresses so many of the key components that cause difficulties for our youth. You can see these different terms, interpersonal effectiveness. How do you navigate your interpersonal relationships? Are you always holding your ground and getting into fights? Are you asking people in an uncomfortable way? Or can you manage your communication in such a way that creates positive relationships that don't add to your stresses? Walking the middle path is, I think it's self-explanatory, but trying to stay between, the lines and not going too high in terms of mood or enthusiasm, too low in terms of being despondent or pessimistic perspectives, and having a centrist approach. And the core of this all is mindfulness and resolving uncertainties about one's own personality, one's own emotional states, one's future, etc. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but I will talk about the different sessions and the different types of ways that the different skills that you see on this slide, courtesy of Dr. Tina Goldstein, no relation, that is part of DBT interventions. So I think you saw part of this graph in Michaela's slides, but I'll add an aspect to this DBT history with the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder. So we have now 4 research coordinators who are licensed social workers who provide DBT therapy in the context of our clinical trials and who have in the past provided exercise intervention therapy. And they expressed to me an interest in learning more about DBT. This was about, I think, 5 years ago. And I said, I fully support us having, at the time we were doing family focused therapy. And I said, I'm fully in support of increasing our armamentarium. I want to make sure that, like, I don't want to sound exaggerated, but like, you might go to a lot of people to get your blood pressure controlled. And in fact, you may in Ontario get such prescriptions or birth control prescriptions from a pharmacist. And I think that that's fine. But if you needed surgery, you'd want to go to very specific people that are highly trained. I think the same is true for the type of individual that requires dialectical behavior therapy. This isn't something to have, I don't want to sound judgmental, or all my DBT colleagues will call me out on it later, but this is something that you should really train rigorously in. This is something that you need to be prepared for managing the responsibility that comes with saying to someone, I'm giving you DBT. That DBT better be a pure form of DBT. It better be an expert form of DBT. It better be from a practitioner who is able to tolerate risk, have a high threshold, and not send someone to the emergency every time, and know the difference of when there is that time to do that. So this is not for the meek, I'll say that. And so I thought we have to learn from the best, and the best is Dr. Tina Goldstein and her group at the University of Pittsburgh, who modified this. And I don't say that lightheartedly, believe me. So what you see here is Tina and our group came together, and we had what was called a dissemination and implementation study. Tina had a number of federally funded trials going on in the United States. And one of the add-on components for one of her trials was this question of, okay, this is looking good. Now, how do we keep this from being an ivory tower intervention that nobody can access? Is we have to be able to say that aside from the site that invented this modified version that's been adapted specifically for these youth with bipolar disorder, can you teach someone else to pull the rabbit out of the hat? And so that's what this grant was about. It was about a dissemination implementation. We had the great good fortune of being the implementation site, meaning the Pittsburgh group trained our social workers, supervised them from a distance, walked them through their first few cases, and essentially imparted in them the skill to be able to deliver this intervention. I'm very proud to say that each of these social workers and research coordinators have achieved DBT licensure through the Linehan board, which is literally the highest certification you can get in this intervention. So that I think is a credit to two things. One is excellent teachers and one is excellent mentees. But the bottom line is when I meet a patient and I say to them, we have this DBT research study, I can look them in the eye and I can say that this is like high quality training. These are people that are experienced as well. So huge thanks to Dr. Tina Goldstein for doing this. And it's enabled us to now launch on questions that we have about DBT, ways that it can be modified, maybe to expand its use, maybe to make it work better for more people. So one study is a full DBT study, meaning people get the Cadillac version. I'll describe that in a moment. And we're looking specifically about who gets better, who doesn't, when do people get better, what changes in the course of the treatment that's an indicator of who's going to get better. The second study is, how do we put fluoride in the water? How do we give people a small dose of DBT for those who don't need or don't want the full dose? You heard the full dose is like, weekly for a year. Not everybody needs that. Dr. Tina Goldstein presented findings earlier today to say that those youth who benefit most from DBT are the ones who come in very, very ill. So it makes sense to have a graded approach as we would for any intervention, and certainly as I do for medications that I prescribe. So we looked at the literature. There's really not a lot out there about kind of a stepped care model, meaning taking people where they're at on the basis of their risk or their desire for DBT, and then scaling them up as needed. So I'll just talk to you about that. Spoiler alert, we don't have the data for it, but what I'm going to talk to you about is kind of how we designed it. And hopefully in future years, we'll tell you how it works. So the full version of DBT, as you can see here, has a number of components. You have about 40 sessions, weekly sessions alternating between individual and family skills. So the individual are therapy sessions and the family sessions are skills oriented. They're not family therapy. They're not targeting family conflict per se. Diary cards that are to be done between sessions where people monitor their mood, their suicidality, their medication adherence, et cetera, customized according to the individual. phone skills. So that's literally having access to your therapist within, there's not 24/7, but outside of office hours, weekends, evenings, if someone's having a moment of dysregulation, they're inclined to reach for a substance, reach for something that's going to cause them self-harm. They can pause for a moment, contact their therapist. It's not a full therapy session, it's a coaching session to bolster the deployment of those skills that they have learned within the DBT sessions. There's consultation team. This work is not light for people. They see things that are rough to see, right? These are the individuals that I'm talking about have come to this career because they want to help people. I can guarantee you they're doing the absolute best, and they see people that are still suffering. It's hard to sit with. And so these consultation teams, I think, provide peer support, provide encouragement, provide a safe space to discuss people's reactions to sessions, etc. So that's what consultation team is. And family involvement is highly encouraged in the study, but it's optional. And then in our study, you have to have a psychiatrist, a KMH, who's willing to oversee the medications that are needed. Then there's this personalized and pragmatic 3-level model. And as I mentioned, some people require full high dose, and some people could benefit from lower dose. So this is a novel multi-level approach of DBT informed treatment, which means it employs DBT skills, DBT education, but it is not full DBT. That is personalized and pragmatic. The decision about dosing, I call it dosing, the 3 different levels of the study, is based on primarily clinical factors. So the extent of emotional dysregulation or mood instability, the extent of risky behaviors. This could be sexual risk behaviors, thrill-seeking behaviors, extreme substance use, etc., and suicidality, as well as patient preference. So you see here the same on the right is what you already saw for the full model of DBT. On the left is level 1. So these are people that maybe not be interested in committing to a lot of therapy, but they'd like to hear a little bit about what these DBT skills are about and be informed a little bit about mindfulness and dialectics. So a dialectic is the idea of holding 2 thoughts that appear to be in opposition or in contradiction, but are both simultaneously true. Such as it's cold in Canada and I like living in Canada. And then there's the in between, the level 2, and that is a DBT skills training. It can involve just the youth or the youth and the parents, and there is a consultation team with that one. It's about 15 to 20 sessions about every 2 weeks. So people are enrolled in this study into only level 1 or level 2. They can't be enrolled into level 3. If they're in need of level 3, they would go into the first study that I mentioned. Once they've come in for a little while, if they're in level 1, they really like it, they want more, they're hungry, or their symptoms have gotten worse, they can go up to level 2, and vice versa, and so on. They can go up to full DBT. So this is, I'm not sure how you guys are experiencing this description, but to me, it seems like kind of really obvious or logical. This is what you do. You start with a little bit if that's what's needed, and then you go up. But it hasn't really been studied. And so we're really looking forward to enrolling people in this study and learning how it goes. So that's DBT. Now I'm going to talk about exercise. The data that you're looking at here is from approximately 100 youth with and without bipolar disorder who answered a self-report screener that's promoted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. It looks at 3 types of physical activity. One is working out. So this is aerobic exercise, high heart rate, short of breath, sweating. The other is working in, so incidental physical activity. If you take the stairs, if you walk, garden, etc. And then the third is sedentary, so seated time, screen time. And there's different recommended benchmarks for each of these. And what you see in the slide is the proportion of youth with bipolar disorder in blue, healthy youth in red, that achieve the minimum recommended benchmark. And what you can see is that contemporary youth in general are not achieving the recommended benchmarks. Youth with bipolar disorder and youth that are without psychiatric illness are the same in terms of sedentary hours and incidental physical activity. But the type of physical activity that youth with bipolar disorder specifically do not engage in is the moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise. 1 in 20 are telling us on a self-report that they're meeting the minimum threshold. And if we believe the literature, it's probably half of that. So I don't get into the subject today. That the main focus of my own personal career is the link between heart disease and bipolar disorder and the importance of heart health to mental health. But we'd like to see youth with bipolar disorder, not at the minimum threshold, but well above the minimum threshold for their mental health benefits. And we're seeing that, 1 in 20 at best reaches this threshold. So what do we do about it? We have these conversations in clinic. It's certainly not a knowledge gap. No one doesn't know that it's good to exercise more. So how do we, and nobody doesn't want to exercise more. So how do we help youth overcome the barriers to a life with more exercise? So another point to make is this is work by Najla Papel, who finished her master's with us a couple of years ago now. We looked at a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. So, how aerobically fit are you? And then we looked at that level of fitness in relation to depression severity. And as you can see here, the lower your aerobic fitness, the greater your depression severity is. This was a cross-sectional study. I can't tell you that low fitness causes depression, although there is epidemiologic evidence to suggest that this goes both ways. But I think it's easy to imagine that if you're depressed, you don't exercise. If you're aerobically unfit, it could predispose you to depression. I want to flag that there are important sex and gender differences in youth bipolar disorder. So unlike other times in the lifespan, the ratio of females to males, I'm referring to sex at this time, with bipolar disorder is 2 to 1 female to male. And everywhere else in the lifespan, it's 1 to 1. And this finding here about the relationship between aerobic fitness and depression, when we looked at it separately by males and females, it was carried by the women. So I think this tells us something about what we need to be thinking about if we're going to be providing treatments. So just to plug the kind of this physical intervention into the emotional relevance of it. We had funding from Brain Canada, and this was a really enjoyable study. So it was a pragmatic trial, which means it's not about showing the superiority of an intervention versus not. It's saying, can you find people to do the intervention? Can you do all the things that you said you would do? This was a collaboration with Andrew, with a patient with bipolar disorder, with a parent of a patient with bipolar disorder, and our research team, all formally involved in the conception, the visioning, and the undertaking of this study. And again, in terms of the number of clinical trials that have been published in the whole field of bipolar disorder in all of time that specifically focus on improving aerobic fitness, I won't ask you to guess, I'll just tell you the number is 0. It's really hard to get your head around. So we thought, okay, we can do better than 0, but we had to invent something that's specifically focused on youth and bipolar disorder. And what you see in the blue is the pieces that were fixed, everybody got them. And then in green were what I call a la carte. If you wanted them, you could have all 3, you could have none of the 3. So people had psychoeducation, education about exercise and its benefits. So one factoid you may not know is that individuals who are the least aerobically fit have the most to gain in terms of their physical health. And we think probably in terms of their mental health. And you don't need to lose any weight for exercise to benefit you. The relationship between weight and exercise, I think for a lot of people is highly stigmatizing and discouraging. And it just doesn't, in my view, really need to be front and center in the conversation. Aerobic fitness benefits your physical health and your cardiac health and your emotional health, even if your weight stays the exact same. So that's a psychoeducation, the bipolar part. Motivation enhancement. So I mentioned our social workers and research coordinators, they gave these motivation building sessions that meet the individual where they're at and try to resolve their ambivalence. I say ambivalence because, as I mentioned, people want to exercise more, they know they should, and they don't. They have mixed feelings about it. And these sessions are intended to help resolve that ambivalence towards action, towards changing decisions making. Weekly phone calls to check in. How do those goals we set go? Objective measures of physical activity and aerobic fitness testing that was objective. So I'm not sure if Rhonda's still here, but we have an exercise expert on our team part-time who oversaw the testing, who was the person that met with people to design some strategies to exercise. And the aerobic fitness testing is involving either a treadmill with increasing speed and increased level of incline, or a step test. These are things that, they're not fun to do, but everybody did them in this study. Everybody attended these motivation enhancing sessions. There was inconsistency about who used the a la carte session. So the bottom line was people showed up, they did the testing, we enrolled 20 youth. When we looked at pre-post exercise sessions, so because we had exercise testing, we looked at mood before and mood after. And we know that on average, the youth with bipolar disorder all had improvements in mood pre-post same day. That echoed a previous study that we'd had. But despite the fact that their mood got better, their behavior didn't really change. Despite the behavior change counseling sessions, they didn't start exercising more, and their aerobic fitness didn't change. And so what that says is we can't stop here. We need to add something to this. So we don't want to throw it out. We think that, we got to that with some good reasoning, but we have three things that this is now in the planning. So three aspects that we're going to add. One is personalized exercise prescription. So looking at the types of environments people want to exercise in, looking at people's baseline fitness to guide that, etc., guided by their fitness testing and their preferences. The second is supervised exercise sessions. So, I didn't like the idea of exercise prescription and supervised sessions. I thought, why don't we have autonomy? Because at the end of the day, people are going to be living their own life, and they're going to have to make this decision on their own. So let's start with trying to have it be on their own. And from our patient and family feedback groups that we had at the end, we got the feedback like, we just kind of wish you would have told us what to do, which was shocking to us, but we're going to listen. So having supervised sessions where people meet at a fixed time, have an agreement, get encouragement, could be by video or could be in person. And then we're considering gym memberships. So there's a number of commercial gyms in the city that, for $20 or $30 a month, people can have a membership. And not that we can do those in the context of a study for life, but the idea being if we can just get people off to a good start, maybe this is something that they could choose to continue. So the last intervention I want to focus on is nitrous oxide. And I want to start by echoing Erin's comments about the challenges of bipolar depression. We heard that youth with bipolar disorder spend at least 40% of the time with significant impairing and distressing symptoms. We heard and we know across the lifespan, bipolar depression is more severe than unipolar depression and more difficult to treat. We have way fewer options. I think, Erin's slide was complete, but even as compared to adults, we have way fewer options that have proven efficacy. The other thing is that most treatments that we prescribe in pills, and certainly this is true for psychotherapies, they take a while to work, even when they do work. And for a lot of people, they need to feel a little bit better ASAP. And so we want to look at novel approaches that aren't part of the same chemistry as any of the approaches we're currently using, and approaches that even if they're not going to be used every single day for the rest of a person's life or for 5 years, they can help for a chapter of life to get them okay enough to be out of hospital and to be non-suicidal. So there's a pressing need for novel treatments that have rapid acting antidepressant effects. So what you see here is our colleagues in anesthesiology. This was started off when we were at Sunnybrook. We did an adult treatment-resistant bipolar depression study. And we did it, I think a theme that you've heard about today is the importance of biomarkers in biology to help give us more knowledge about objective targets, about what's moving, like a person gets better. How did that happen? And how can that knowledge about neuroscience help us tweak the intervention, help us get more people better? So we actually gave people either nitrous oxide by mask or a medication called midazolam, which is also an anesthetic that's not known to have antidepressant properties, through an intravenous. So all of the participants had both a mask and intravenous. They didn't know which they got. We didn't know which they got, but they were lying in the scanner getting this. And it was, I think, an extremely bold study. And we were actually concerned. We wanted to start with youth, but we just thought that Health Canada and our institution might kind of maybe get rid of us if we did that. So we started with adults, and I'll show you what we found. But we are definitely moving towards this in youth. So in this study, we recruited 25 adults with treatment-resistant bipolar depression. I mentioned that it's in the scanner. There's a lot of exclusion criteria that keep people from doing a study if it involves MRI, any certain things with piercings, tattoos, et cetera, that adds to a lot of the exclusion criteria we have in clinical trials anyway. So Michaela, who you heard from, and Danielle, who you heard about, screened to get these 25 people, no less than 430 adults with bipolar disorder who expressed interest and spoke to them on the phone. So this was a labor of love, to put it mildly, but we had 25 brave souls who did this study, and this is what I'm presenting to you here. It was single session, and at the time that we conceived of the study, nitrous oxide had never been published on in mood disorders. So since then, there's been a couple of studies, but we wanted to be super, super safe. For one, this is bipolar disorder, and as you heard from Sunny eloquently, antidepressant properties can potentially precipitate a manic episode. So you don't want to do that clinically. You certainly don't want to do it in a study. You certainly don't want to do it with a person lying in a scanner far away from other clinical services in the hospital. So we started with a very low duration of 20 minutes and a very conservative concentration of 25%, meaning the rest of it is oxygen. And what we found was that overall, it didn't make a significant difference. A caveat to that is that the study didn't have enough people to be a meaningful test. Like, it would have had to be outlandishly amazing to have shown an effect in that study. To give an image, if you saw the picture of the anesthesiologists, the psychiatrist was there, the team was there, like what you would consider a placebo response, the sense of comfort that comes from that midazolam group is pretty tough to beat. So this is all really something that's moving us to the next chapter. But if you looked at the same day, so the 2-hour post-treatment, the 4-hour post-treatment, and the 6-hour the hour, 2-hour, and 4-hour post-treatment, if you added those all together, nitrous oxide was superior to midazolam. So you could say, well, what's the big deal? And I would say I agree. To make someone feel better, more than midazolam for one day isn't what we're looking for, but it's a bit of a signal, I think, that shows some promise. And since there have been studies in treatment-resistant unipolar depression in adults. In terms of imaging, you may be wondering how this can make a difference. So we're specifically interested in cerebral blood flow to the brain, especially in specific regions, like what's called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is considered a hub underlying the neurobiology of depression. In orange, you see the individuals that got midazolam, and in blue, you see the individuals that got nitrous oxide. And our question was, if blood flow is really relevant to depression and blood flow is relevant to how nitrous oxide works, it should be predicting who responds to nitrous oxide. And indeed, this aspect was aligned with what we expected. So those people, the adults with bipolar depression resistant to other treatments that had the lowest blood flow in their anterior cingulate cortex and got nitrous oxide had the most robust responses. So this isn't the end of the story, but it's obviously, as you can imagine, rewarding in terms of let's continue this search for understanding how this medicine works and in whom, and maybe work towards selecting treatments based on this sort of approach. Meet NitroBD. So nitrous oxide inhalation treatment for bipolar depression in youth is what we've just recently submitted to the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Fingers crossed that we're funded. But this is a study that we are going to do. And we're going to keep the same concentration, 25%, because subsequent studies found that in adults with resistant unipolar depression, that was better tolerated than a higher dose and equally effective. Instead of doing 20 minutes, we're going to give people 60 minutes. And instead of doing one session, we're going to give them 4 sessions over 2 weeks. In addition to those sessions, we're going to integrate pre and post brain imaging and multiple blood tests along the way to see what is happening in the brain and what is happening in the body in response to these different treatments. Where is this all going? And I say here potential clinical implications, what I would consider aspirational. If things work out as good as we could potentially hope, what would be different? This would buy time for prescribed medications to work and give people hope. This would potentially prevent emergency department visits and hospitalizations that are not only a burden on the healthcare system, but they stress out families and they stress out patients. You heard about a young individual who forgot a day of her life, and bipolar disorder itself is part of that, but the trauma, even though it's the place that people have to go to when they need to go to, of a hospitalization is something we try to avoid if it's not absolutely needed. So just to prevent a hospitalization would be a massive success. Shorten hospitalization. So people want to get back to school, they want to get back to work. Could this type of rapid acting intervention abbreviate their admissions? And, this is just kind of thinking out loud, but someone that has a severe depression that has just kind of started, but we know from their history tends to, once it gets stuck. Can we intercept that? Can we kind of unstick it before it gets stuck? Because we know that once it's stuck, it takes a long time to get people better. So this is kind of best case scenario, but that's the goal mark that we think about to motivate through when people tell us these are silly ideas or not realistic, or that youth with bipolar disorder won't do these. We're pretty confident that they will. So I conclude with what I call dialectical conclusions. So there's the bad and the good. So on the rough side is that youth with bipolar disorder are highly complex, high symptom burden, high rates of co-occurring illnesses, risk-related concerns. There's a lot of gaps in knowledge about treatment that we have to deal with. So this is the rough part. And then there's the other part that is simultaneously true. The vast majority of youth with bipolar disorder experience recovery. Treatment improves symptoms, functioning, and safety. There are many ways to improve future outcomes that lie before us to try. We can increase access to the treatments that are currently available. We can identify and validate novel treatments like you've heard about. So either tweaking treatments that exist or trying brand new treatments. We can integrate mind, brain, and body and stop treating bipolar disorder like it exists from here up. It clearly exists from head to toe. We're especially interested in heart and brain, but it's throughout the body. And I mean that literally. And then to destigmatize bipolar disorder and its treatments. Like there's absolutely no reason that someone should have to be told this is hormones or this is whatever kind of generic stressor. You know who manages hormones? Every single person that goes through adolescence. And yet it's 98% of them don't have bipolar disorder. So, it's the several hundredth time to hear that. So we really need to destigmatize, to educate people that this is not mood swings. This is not challenges. This is not distress. This is a medical illness. So that's the end of my research presentation. I've gone a little bit over time. I think my early career investigators are being so succinct that I knew I had a few extra minutes. Michaela's going to call me on it later. That's okay. I wanted to highlight something really fantastic that if you don't have this right now, I believe that we have copies on your way out. About 2 years ago now, we launched a youth advisory council. So these are youth that had been kind of experienced working with CYBD. They had a minimum of 5 years as patients and as research participants in our studies. And so that put them in a position to be our advisors and to counsel us about future directions, about ideas. We also wanted it to be a group that worked together with a project, that there would be an output, that their time would be reflected in something tangible that they could feel good about, that we could feel good about. And most importantly, that youth that we or they had never met could benefit from. And so what they came up with was this idea of a booklet. And it's titled Never Alone. It didn't have the title initially. Never Alone, A Youth's Guide to Bipolar Disorder, written by youth for youth. So there's lots of books. Some of them are scientific and clinical. Some of them are more patient and family and public focused, but there's really not a lot. I know we heard from colleagues in Denmark that they have similar approach. There's really a gap in hearing from people who lived experience in a constructive, forward-oriented, solution-focused, encouraging way. And that is precisely what we got from our 6 youth authors, AJ, Annie, Kay Lee, Kathleen, Seema, and Tara, who had a series of meetings, came up with themes that they wanted to focus on, came up with ways that they wanted to weigh in on it, and then organized the answers that they got from themselves into chapters. So this is the cover, the front cover and the back cover. I won't read it out entirely, but we were very honored. For me, having read this booklet, I really wanted a luminary to weigh in on the back of this booklet. I wanted someone that would say, like, don't take Ben's perspective for it, or all the CYBD team that thinks you're awesome. Like, this is a person that is objective, hasn't met you. So Dr. Kay Jamieson is an individual that lives with bipolar disorder and that studies bipolar disorder. And I would say is the world leader in terms of sharing experiences in public books, best-selling books about bipolar disorder. And she was very much inspired and shared this quote. So that is publicly available. We're going to give copies out to those in attendance. For those not in attendance, it's on our website as a downloadable PDF. It's the exact same product. And we hope that this flies far and wide and inspires people. As I mentioned, my main career focus is the vascular bipolar connection, but this relates to more than physical health. And I just wanted to introduce you, for those who are new to CYBD, to our icon and our motto, which is Heart Bipolar. To us, the heart not only represents dedication and care, but is a symbol that bipolar is linked to cardiovascular risk and affects mind, brain, and body. So that's, if you see this symbol, or if you see Heart Bipolar, or you hear Andrew make that sign, that's where it comes from. Wanted to acknowledge again the patients, research participants, and families, donors who have funded us, including those whose families have been affected by bipolar disorder. And to the CYBD team who makes all of this work worthwhile and enjoyable, and about whom I'm extremely proud for reasons I think that were extremely prominent today. Thank you for coming this evening. And what I'm going to do now is invite all of the speakers to come to the front, and we're going to take the questions that have emerged from the audience, and I'll read them to those to whom they relate. So thank you. We'll just huddle, or you want to keep 6 feet. So one of the questions is it possible to have bipolar disorder even if no one in your family has it? And can you have bipolar disorder? I think I can't read it well. Can you only have bipolar disorder if you're someone in your family has it? Does anyone want to answer that one? Aaron.
I can
Yeah.
answer that one. Yeah. I think the answer is the short answer is yes. And I think that someone in your family having bipolar disorder increases the risk. But there's a lot of things we don't understand about the reasons people develop bipolar disorder, and it doesn't have to be something that runs in their family.
So we'll alternate between different presenters. So one of the questions was, as bipolar has been studied for some time, is there any understanding or knowledge that BD may skip a generation? I would say that clinically, this is something that I've seen a lot of times, but in terms of research on it, I can't give you an answer. We do think that the extent of genetic risk, as you heard from Joyce, is larger based on two things. One is the proximity of that relative to the individual. So first degree relative, much more meaningful than a second degree relative, but also even if it's second degree relatives, if it's multiple relatives, that adds up. So I think we think of familial risk for bipolar disorder as additive in the same type of way as we think of the molecular genetics as additive. If you've got two sides of the family with bipolar, we have a higher index of suspicion. If you have multiple generations, higher index of suspicion. Okay. So one of the questions is a quick one. Will the recording of tonight's session be shared? We are going to make it public on our website for those here. What is the relationship between childhood trauma and onset of bipolar disorder? Does anyone else want that? You want? Oh, okay, I'll take it. The quick answer is that in our own population that we've studied, these are people that come to a hospital. We have about 10% that have had meaningful physical or sexual abuse, but generally speaking, trauma is important, not just in terms of its frequency, but there's also dimension of trauma. Essentially, the more trauma, the worse, the earlier, the worse. And we know that it presents different considerations to treatments. You heard about the trauma being asked about things again and again. So we have to be sensitive to the extent to which someone's had trauma. Also, in terms of some things like psychotherapy, some psychotherapies have now been shown to be effective in like 4 or 5 sessions. If someone, this isn't specific to bipolar disorder, it's all psychotherapy. It's not a good idea if someone has a history of trauma to give them brief sessions where they are expected to connect with someone, then disconnect with someone, tell their whole story, and then not continue. So we generally think of longer treatments for people with trauma. And we have to expect that on average, they're going to have more complicated clinical characteristics in terms of anxiety and potentially substance use and things like that. So suffice it to say that it's a very important variable. For the most part, it involves some amount of modification, but there's still the need to give the same types of treatments. For next year, we're going to make a note that we're not going to do this in pencil. We're going to put this in red pen. So I'll give this one to Dr. Silverman. What are different ways mania can surface? What are different types of manic episodes?
So maybe I'll start by saying what a manic episode is, but so a manic episode to be diagnosed has to have all the symptoms that we talked about earlier, like an elated mood or irritable mood and high energy and goal-directed activity, and it has to be along with 3 or 4 other symptoms and last at least a week. But if we look at different types of episodes that are related to mania, so hypomanic episodes would be one to compare it to. And if you look at the differences between mania and hypomanic episodes, a hypomanic episode doesn't have to last quite as long. It has to only be 4 days long. And it can affect your functioning if you have a hypomanic episode, but what would make it a manic episode would be if it really severely impairs functioning or results in significant risk to yourself or other people that might require going into the hospital, or is associated with what we call psychotic symptoms, which involve delusions or fixed false beliefs or hallucinations. And maybe the last part I'll add is that there's kind of this other kind of category of what we should call bipolar spectrum or other specified bipolar. It doesn't quite have all the criteria of mania or hypomania, but to kind of have that, you would have to have kind of manic symptoms for most of the day, and it'd be observable to other people as well. And last for 4 days. They don't have to be consecutive. So it's a lot of detail, but I hope that answers the question.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Okay. So this is a great question. Beyond genetics, is there a differential in the transmission or treatment of bipolar in terms of race, ethnicity, or class? If yes, how can this be addressed? So there's a race question. There's the it says class, socioeconomic status, or social position. I'll give part of the answer, and then I'll ask Joyce to explain one of the limitations in our molecular genetic data. So we don't have great data to directly answer this question in terms of transmissibility. What I can tell you is if you look at worldwide epidemiologic studies on bipolar disorder in the general population of many different studies, they're very, very similar. So what that means is in most parts of the world, people with bipolar have more co-occurring illnesses than the average psychiatric condition. In most parts of the world, that spectrum of bipolar disorder is impairing just as much as bipolar disorder type 1. These are things that exist in Africa, in India, in Asia, in North America. There are some differences, I believe, that are not true differences because we still rely on reporting. There's certain places where there's extremely low prevalence of bipolar disorder, but they're very much outliers. And I think most likely, so India is one example. And then there's people that have hypothesized this because there's a lot of turmeric or curcumin, which is an antioxidant. I think it's a little bit rich. I think it's more likely some differences in terms of their surveying and societal differences. But overall, the international epidemiology of bipolar disorder has a lot of similarities across countries. In terms of offspring studies, I think from the Pittsburgh bipolar offspring studies and socioeconomic status, it showed that youth who have a parent with bipolar disorder are at increased risk for not just bipolar disorder, but other forms of psychiatric illnesses. But that was much more true in those that had low socioeconomic status than high. So those that had low socioeconomic status were especially predisposed, and less so those that had high. So I think that from a treatment perspective, from a symptom burden perspective, that does make a big difference, I think, for a number of reasons that we could think about. Joyce, did you want to say something from the genetic side about why we don't have an answer? About race, yeah.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier in my talk, we now know that a lot of genes are involved in the increased risk for bipolar disorder. But the problem or like the limitation for that is this kind of genetic data were collected from adults of European ancestry. And people of other ancestry, such as African or East Asian ancestry, they tend to have different genetic structures than European people with European ancestry, such as the frequency or effect of their genetic variants. So the genetic data that we collected from people of European ancestry doesn't really generalize well to people of different or other ancestries. So that would cause limitations of the polygenic risk scores that we can calculate it right now, because they really only applies to this one ancestry, but not the others. So that's the main limitations that we have right now with polygenic risk scores. And we definitely need more genetic data that collected from other ancestries in order to generate this scores, this tool.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you.
So I think I know who this one is for. What is the connection between neuroscience, suicidality, and DBT? Anyone?
So the connection between neuroscience, DBT, and suicidality is that DBT is a treatment that we are hopefully using to decrease suicidality, and we're hopefully going to use neuroscience to understand exactly how DBT works to decrease suicidality.
And again, just a reminder that all the presentations, including the slides, are all going to be available. So for those people that saw something that they like and didn't take a picture or whatever, that'll be available to you to go over slowly. And we're happy to hear more questions through emails. Our overall group email is youth.bipolar@camh.ca. And if people have questions about this evening that they think about afterwards, feel free to send them to us. How can we get helpful therapies like it says IPSRT more available? I think the question is about how do you get research grade interventions into society. I think there's some examples of that happening. So in Alberta, whereas in Ontario, we don't have broadly publicly available psychotherapy. In Alberta, they do. And to the best of my understanding, that's pretty specific to evidence-based therapies. So it just becomes a provincial mandate. So I think that those people that are making decisions in the province of Ontario, it would be great for those decisions to be informed by the evidence that exists. It's not to say that that there's only one type of therapy, but that should be really a driver, not just that it sounds good, but that it's been shown to work. And so that would be my quick answer to that. Is fecal matter transfer a viable treatment? For those who haven't heard about this, it may sound weird, but it's not weird. This is something that has been tried for a number of conditions. The idea that you have gut bacteria that are part of, being a human being. We have these organisms that live within us, and we have a good balance in general. But for some people, the balance is off, and there's been some people studying fecal transplant. We do not. I would say that this, my candid appraisal is I think this had a lot of hype behind it. I don't think we're going to be seeing changes in treatment about this in the future years, but I could be wrong. So come back and wave a finger at me if that's the case. And I think at that point we'll conclude, and I'll say thank you to the panel, and feel free to stick around and mingle. Thank you.